Good afternoon. My name is Karen Griffith Gryga, and I am Chief Investment Officer for Dreamit. Welcome to the ongoing Dreamit webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about Finance 101 for Startup Founders. There is a way to submit questions, so feel free to do so, and we will try to address them. Also, feel free to share commentary and or follow us on Twitter at Dreamit. Today with me is Dreamit alumni, co-founder Matt Loper of Wellth, as well as Gene Godick. Gene is an experienced CFO, both for large established companies as well as startups. So we're going to start real quickly by just having Matt and Gene briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll go into a overview presentation that Gene has put together for us. Matt, you want to give us a quick overview of your background?
Thanks very much, Karen. So my background is actually from the finance field. After college, I went to Goldman Sachs and did 2 years of healthcare investment banking there. Moved on from Goldman Sachs to do public equity investing at a big firm focused on the healthcare space called OrbiMed. Was there for about 3 years while having the idea of Wellth and making the crazy decision to quit my day job and focus on Wellth full time. So I've had both experiences of being on the finance side, being on the investor side, and now, as an entrepreneur, we participated in the Dreamit class last year. We're very fortunate to become a Dreamit portfolio company as part of our seed round. And I'd say just a quick plug for Dreamit. We've done 3 accelerators now. Dreamit's been by far the most impactful for us as a company. I still get emails all the time from Karen and Steve and others trying to connect us to potential customers, and that's something that a lot of other accelerators, you're done with the program and it's done. So we're very appreciative and love the Dreamit family very much.
Thank you, Matt. Gene?
Thanks, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here. So my background is I grew up in the Philadelphia tech community since I started. I started out in public accounting, working with 2 of the big firms in Philly, working with primarily venture-backed startups, early-stage companies, starting back in 1987. And I've grown up in this community and watched it thrive over the last almost 30 years since I started my career. In 1998, I had the pleasure of joining a company called VerticalNet, and in 1999, led the company's IPO as the company's CFO. It was the number 2-3 performing IPO of 1999. During that time, came close to raising $400 million. Did about 25 M&A transactions. After the bubble crashed, restructured the business and turned it from an internet company into one of the earlier publicly traded SaaS businesses. In 2006, had the pleasure of buying a e-commerce and catalog company, ran that business for 5.5 years, and then sold it in 2012, and then decided to start a business of providing outsourced CFO services. And the premise of the business was that a lot of early stage and entrepreneurial companies need CFO level talent, but they don't need it all the time. And fast forward 4.5 years later, we're now a firm of over 20 people working with 30 plus companies from DC to New York in a variety of industries, from software to medical wearables to some things that aren't as technology driven like a logistics business. But for the most part, we're focused on SaaS businesses in the Philadelphia and New York area that are venture backed, including we're working with at least one Dreamit company that I can count on as of now.
Terrific. So why don't we launch into the presentation that you've put together for us?
Great. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the screen, but so I am me and I presented who I am. So I mean, when you start a new business, the challenges can be daunting. There's a lot of things that we need, an early stage entrepreneur needs to accomplish, figure out the market is, the product timing fit, get some funding for the business, tell initial investors what they're going to, what they can expect for their initial investments. I think one of the hardest things is being able to hire a team, and then really focusing on, how you're going to allocate resources, how long will those resources that you've raised last, and what are you going to accomplish them with. So, I mean, starting a new business, I think for any entrepreneur, no matter how challenged, no matter how experienced, can be a challenging process. And there's a lot of things that you need to be able to accomplish all at the same time. From a finance perspective, I think one of the first things that people should do is, first kind of like build a long-term forecast. People are going to want to understand, how big this business can be, what will your margins be, what's your initial assessment of how much cash you will need, what are you going to accomplish with that cash. I think that's a critical thing. And then I think if you move on to that is, once you've done your long-term forecast, we recommend for a lot of our early stage companies that have minimal amounts of cash, is like to start doing a short-term cash flow forecast, assess your cash flow. For some of our companies that are struggling or have minimal resources between raises, we'll sometimes start doing a 13-week cash flow. Ultimately, people are going to see your results. They're going to want to see your results against plan. And then I think a lot of things that what people do when they start looking at their variances against what they expect to see is, was the plan wrong? Did you not execute right? Do you adjust your plan going forward? So I think understanding your forecast, gives you a lot of insight into how you want to run the business. Looking at your actual results gives you a chance to see what adjustments you need to make to figure out the difference between what you expected to happen and what did happen. So why is it important to build a forecast? I mean, I think it allows you to really think about how you want to run the business as you see it. It's kind of like a utopian world, but a lot of times when we get hired by a new client, a lot of the things we like to do first is really build the model, because it allows us to really focus on what are the economic drivers that really build the business. How does the CEO or the head of sales or chief revenue officer think about how they're going to get that incremental revenue? I love to build it when we build these models by looking at, how do these sales occur? Is it a salesperson, or is it a website where you're looking at how many visits are coming and how many people convert? But really allow you to get under the hood and look at some of the economic drivers that are going to drive the business. It also allows you to play what if. What happens if things don't count? I mean, like as the company grows, you'll be able to stress test the model, think about different things you want to do. It allows you to kind of sit there and say, hey, I have a limited amount of capital. How am I going to allocate my resources? Which is really important. And I think one of the most important jobs that a CEO has is, am I going to invest more in sales or product development? Because sometimes you only have so much money and you can't maybe do both. And what it ultimately does is allows you to focus tactically as to how you're going to grow the business, and it gives you it helps along with the business plan, gives you a playbook as to how you want to run your business. So, I mean, if you think about a long-term forecast, and we don't build that many models for clients that are 5 years until really they're getting into a Series B, but it allows you to think about that initial model. Sometimes investors will want to see, how do you think about the business in 3 to 5 years? It gives you something to point to. It at least allows the investors to think about how you thought about the business when they build their own model. A really good model will include, historic, balance, obviously a projected P&L, as well as balance sheet, cash flows, as well as like key performance indicators. How many customers you expect to get? What's the average selling price? Things like that. Some of the more qualitative and quantitative aspects of building of what an investor want to be able to see, because ultimately the investors will be able to use that to help value the business as well as hold you accountable in the future. I mean, things to think about when you build your sales forecast is, how long do you think it's going to, how long is it going to take you to get in the market? What's a customer willing to pay? Thinking about demand penetration. We've been working with a client now that's getting ready to introduce a new mass market product, and we're going to probably build it looking at a market penetration as opposed to salespeople, but there's a lot of ways to kind of think about revenue. If you're building a B2B SaaS business, you may want to think about quota-bearing SaaS, quota-bearing salespeople. If you're building an e-commerce business, maybe you think about conversion rates. Some of our clients are seasonal, some aren't. If you're a SaaS business, November, December tend to be great months. July and August tend to be really tough months to sell software. Building a sales forecast, when we look at our clients and we look at budgets and forecasts they've had, usually most of our companies get expenses right. They tend to, we try to get our clients to be conservative in terms of spending, but building the sales forecast is really hard, and and most likely you'll be wrong. You usually just don't know by how much and in which direction. Things to kind of think about in your forecast from a cost side is, how much labor, tooling you're going to need, how much you're going to need to compensate people, what will your compensation plan be, how much money will you need to spend on marketing, some of the things around product development, how many engineers and coders will you need, who else are you going to need to have on the executive team, as well as things like the basics of rent, insurance, things that run the office. If you're an early stage company, you need happy hours. What are you going to need to do to drive your culture? But I think there's a lot of things that people need to ultimately get in the forecast and think about is how they're going to run the business. And a lot of ways, your budget is an expression of somewhat of your values and how you're going to run the business. Other things that I've talked about earlier, other things that people want to see is, projected number of customers, projected bookings by month, by quarter, how much headcount will you have, how much will it cost you to acquire a customer. One of the questions we often get asked is, what are your long-term margins for the business at scale? How much, and then what kind of unit economics will you have? We find a lot of companies tend to think macro, but they don't think micro. And one of the things that we've been pushing with a lot of our clients is to really think is, what is that unit economics for an individual customer? What will they look like as the business scales? Some things to think about, once you've gotten past the round is, after you've raised a few dollars, some things, to kind of sit back and think is, remember all the promises you made. Nothing kind of infuriates a new investor right after you've raised money that said, that forecast we gave you probably isn't that realistic, and we're going to need to kind of reset the budget because of X, Y, Z. I think, while you need to have a budget that's going to attract, and it's going to get investors excited about the company, at the same time, it needs to be realistic, and it needs to be something that you'll be able to execute on after raising the capital. A lot of times, new companies or even more mature businesses are only raising money from anywhere from 6 to 18 months. So in those early rounds, it may be only 6 to 12 months. So you really need to almost start thinking about your next raise now. You may not start executing it, but you need to start thinking about what it looks like and what you're going to need to accomplish to make, as a company, to make sure you're ready for that next raise. And I think one of the most important things is really try to be productive. Series A and particularly Series B investors love capital efficient businesses. So if you're able to acquire new customers effectively, you're able to, and efficiently, you will be rewarded for that in your next round of, as your next fundraise. Move through, one of the things I always try to tell earlier the business is, we start asking companies, and most times we do it for them, where we start looking at cash flow week by week, where we start out plotting what each expected receipt, each expected disbursement, so that we can see how much cash will be on hand at any particular point in time, and so we can make adjustments But as like companies particularly are raising capital, they want to make sure that they don't run out of money before they get to the next fundraise. And it's a pretty important part. We also see it at times when companies are in the sale process and they're operating a limited amount of capital. And so, where do you start with? We kind of go through and start, how much cash do we have on hand and how many months or weeks we have of cash on hand, and we start to then plot out the revenue streams. But as I talked about before, we start looking at, on a very detailed basis, receipts and disbursements, when we expect them. We go customer by customer, vendor by vendor, just so we can map out our cash. One of the things that I think is real important is for entrepreneurs to really understand, their financial statements. And investors are going to expect each month for the company at a minimum to be able to give a P&L, a balance sheet, and cash flow, as well as they expect them to be right, and they expect that the entrepreneur will be able to understand them. And a lot of times, that's why we get brought in, is we're able to help the company not only just put together the P&L, balance sheet, and cash flow on a GAAP basis, but we're also able to help them figure out which KPIs are important, how to measure those KPIs on a regular and consistent basis, as well as other things that boards really expect from their companies is budget versus actual. They expect, at least with the boards we work with, they expect that the budgets we presented in the fundraising process, the company will start showing budgets versus actual, so they can get a sense of how well the company is doing against what they had promised in the process. And then importantly as well is understanding, why aren't things working the way, or why are things better than what was discussed earlier in terms of the plan. So it's one thing to be off plan, it's another thing not to know why you're off plan. And so sometimes I try to isolate things. There are some mistakes in the plan that just were unforeseen, and some things are just more execution issues that need to be worked on as the company evolves. And then I think other things that people need to just think about is the metrics that that boards expect in terms of KPIs and metrics. So GAAP financial statements certainly have their limitations. And so I think there's a lot of things that people really want to understand, particularly about early stage companies, is what's the burn rate, how much cash do you have on hand, how many months of cash do we have on hand, bookings and billings, as well as customer retention rate, both logo as well as dollar, and margin. So I mean, these are just some of the things that we think about, but I think investors are just as excited about seeing the statements as they are the KPIs. And I think in a lot of the early stage companies, the KPIs are probably way more important to an early stage company than the financials. So, and then I think once, every 3-4 months, you probably need to start updating your forecast after what you've learned from your early months of operating. I mean, we're getting into the second quarter for a lot of our companies now. We're beginning to update the forecast for things we're learning, both good and bad, that are going to impact the business and what the company can accomplish over the next 12 to 18 months. So this is just a quick advertisement for us, which I kind of gave in the beginning. So that's kind of the end of the formal part of my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Gene. We appreciate that. So that was really informative. And this is such a rich topic. It's hard to address everything in an hour. But let's start with Matt. Developing your early stage projections is really, really challenging. And you've been on both sides of the table. So could you share with us kind of your experience with Wellth, your thinking and an approach on how to go about doing all this?
Sure. So as I said earlier, a lot of my kind of experience before starting Wellth was much more big, mature, publicly traded companies. And you have to realize for financials and for valuation, everything, there's an art to it and there's a science to it. At those more mature stages, it's much more science than art. I spent most of my time trying to do a lot of research and way more precise about my projections than anyone else on Wall Street, so I could, have an quote unquote edge. The problem is once you start an early stage company, it's almost all art and no science. And I think this is a problem I see with a lot of early stage companies when I see them pitch at events or whatnot, is they put up precise projections on the screen and say, here's our next 5 years and how we're going to hit all these huge, huge numbers. And of course, there's this huge hockey stick growth. And I just know that as an early stage company, there's so many variables that is completely false precision. So if you understand the science of creating a model and what goes into the accounting and how to create these projections, you can create a great model, but it's garbage in, garbage out. If all your assumptions are complete garbage, the results, the output is going to be completely meaningless. So the approach I took when we started fundraising was understanding our industry. We sell to hospitals and health insurers. Those are very, very slow moving organizations with long sales cycles. So in our business, we knew that there was going to be a long period of time where we had to develop a product before we start generating revenues. So the approach I took was, I have no ability to project when and who is going to sign at what date in the future. But what I'll do is I'll start by proving to you that there's a huge total addressable market here. Here's all the math market. Here is why we have a solution that is very crucial and needed by this market. And here is the math around each one of those, any large insurance company or any large provider group. Here is what you would expect to generate in terms of revenues at what margins at scale. So just start by convincing the investors, okay, so here is the end game. Here's every new customer, what the economics would look like. So if you agree with us that there's a huge market here and we solve a crucial need for that business, and you agree with our economics at scale, here's how we're going to get there. I'm going to be super conservative. I'm going to say it takes us way longer than we expect to sign some of those customers. Here's how we're going to manage our burn. In the meantime, here are the kind of metrics we have to hit before we can start showing revenue. We have to, sign a pilot that shows results. We have to turn that results into a sales pipeline. Here, we have to turn that sales pipeline into deals. Then at that point, we start generating revenue. So some investors, they're not going to buy into that long-term thesis. They're going to, we need to see near-term revenues. That's totally fine. As an entrepreneur, what you need to find is investors that are in it for the long haul with you, that share your long-term vision and are willing to make that investment in you as a company, in you as a product for the long term. Otherwise, there's going to be a complete mismatch. 6 months down the road or a year down the road, when you're having a board meeting and your board is, hey, you promised us all these results and we're not seeing it yet. So I think it's always better to manage expectations and present a very conservative case, almost mostly conservative, to show, hey, in the near term, we have no ability to project growth. So we're just going to show you the worst case scenario and how we can weather this storm of this valley of death, right, between fundraising and kind of the next stage of fundraising or customer adoption or market traction. So sell them on the term, sell them on the economics of the long term, do all the math in a precise fashion about the long-term vision, but in the near term, try to be overly conservative and just show the downside scenarios.
Terrific. That's really helpful. Which kind of, leads into the question, Gene talked about in his presentation about different ways to approach your forecast. But at Dreamit, we're huge fans of a bottoms-up build, right? Which means you start from your core assumptions, whether it be the sales time frame, the customer acquisition process, then, what type of sales pipeline leads into that, and really building everything from the ground up. A key part of that is, these performance indicators, right? KPIs. So we're getting a lot of questions from people about KPIs, and what everybody should realize is that KPIs are specific to each company, its business model, and the industry. But having said that, how did you, and Gene, I'll switch to you in a second, but Matt, how do you think about defining your KPIs for Wellth in the early stages?
Yeah, so I think in the early stages, and we're still, we're still early stage in a sense, but we're starting to reach a nice point of traction where we're starting to generate revenue and starting to think about pipeline growth and all those metrics. But I think you just need to work backwards. You think about, here are the steps I have to hit in order to get where I want to go. So I know that's vague, but for example, we said, look, before anyone buys this, we got this feedback from a bunch of insurance companies and hospitals, they're going to want to see results. Well, what results do they need to see? They need to see that people enroll in the program, that patients themselves. So if a hospital, let's say, was going to roll out this program, what % of patients are actually going to download our app, enroll in the program? What % adherence, because we're very focused on adherence to care plans, are we going to be able to show in these different chronic disease states? How many patients every day are going to take their medications as prescribed? How long does that behavior last? What does the control group of doing nothing look like? And you can either do a randomly controlled study and show that versus control, or you can look up some industry stats and make some assumptions. And then, so that's everything in terms of product efficacy. Here's a bunch of KPIs. How many patients do we get to enroll? How many of those patients are adherent? How many of those patients even reach clinical milestones like reduced readmissions or lowered A1C results as a diabetic? So first, your product works, and so there's a bunch of meta KPIs in terms of, all right, our product works, customers are willing to pay our price, and we're able to actually acquire new customers. But then each of those categories has a bunch of sub KPIs, like, does your product work? Well, it could work really well, but if no one uses it, then it doesn't work at all, right? So breaking down various milestones within the customer journey or the patient journey, and actually measuring those. And you can measure those in very cheap ways, right? Our first pilot, we enrolled people in person at American Diabetes Association Walk. We enrolled people on Reddit, our diabetes. And you can do it yourself and de-risk as much as possible as early as possible. You don't have to sit around and wait for a big medical system like Penn to come along and say, yes, we're willing to run this in our patients, which we now finally are at that stage. You can start by just de-risking as much as possible to start and measuring some of these metrics. And as long as, it's tougher if you're a medical device, there's patient safety issues, but if you're a workflow or data or patient-focused tech company, you can measure these things in a safe and effective manner pretty cheaply by just recruiting patients.
Great. Gene, could you share with us some of your advice on how companies should go about thinking about kind of defining their core KPIs?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of metrics that people want to track. I think, most of our clients we work with tend to be software, SaaS businesses, and I think there's a core group of KPIs such as bookings and billings that people want to see and expect to see, and but there's other things where you want to look at things like CAC and show how efficiently you're acquiring businesses. So but I think there's other things along the way. What's the pipeline look like, I think, is important. We'll look at sometimes with companies after they've raised a Series A, people will start looking to see how much pipeline coverage they have, so they can see how they're going to do in meeting each quarter. But I think things go back to, there's one side, there's a sales side, and there's also, the other thing is around usage. We've had some early stage companies who were successful in sales, but when they started getting to the usage metrics, the numbers weren't there, and that portends to be weaker renewals than you'd like to see. And then I think the other thing is that, particularly where SaaS businesses, people are interested in seeing is around churn and renewal rates, looking at logo churn versus renewal, versus dollar retention. But I think there's a lot of metrics around there. How much do you get to profit per customer? But if you start thinking about the high level, I think you start at bookings and billings and the sales cycle, and you start working your way from sales cycle to being then customer metrics, once they've kind of evolved and been a customer, how long they're going to be a customer, which I think then plays well into beginning to be able to look into customer lifetime value.
Right. So if I step back and offer some high-level advice, as an early stage company at the highest level, there's probably 3 to 5 core KPIs that are most meaningful for your business. So there, as Gene mentioned, there are standard KPIs for different types of companies in different industries. So you're going to want to do your homework to find out what's relevant for your industry and your business model. And really what you want is indicators that are early indicators that tell you whether or not things are going well or not. And as an early stage company, that may not be revenue early on, as Matt indicated, right? So he was prior to revenue, but were, people interested in a service? Were they willing to engage with it? There's other things that may precede actual financials or revenue indicators. There are some non-financial indicators that are important as well that could be very qualitative as far as customer satisfaction, again, depending upon your business. And you kind of have to keep the big picture in mind and the near-term execution in mind, and really putting those together. So there's a lot out there on the web about KPIs and finding the right KPIs, but it's something, in my mind, Rome isn't built in a day, and you start somewhere, and then you constantly evolve both your measurements and your thinking. Matt, do you want to share with us kind of some of your evolution lessons, where you started and where you are today, and how that process has evolved, both on your KPIs and your assumptions?
Absolutely. So I think, Karen, you just summed it up perfectly, is, it's understanding your business model once you get to that stage when you are actually, what your customer acquisition cost is, how long it takes to close a deal, but doing as much as possible early on to de-risk those assumptions later on, right? So how do you early on you think about your business and say, where are the key bets, quote unquote? Where are the key things where an investor would have to take a leap of faith? And as much as possible, you can test those early bets and de-risk them. The more you de-risk, the more investor interest you're going to get. So, for example, this is a typical lean startup methodology: is you just put up a pre-sale site, right? Let's say you're selling a widget online, and it's this new great widget, and you're selling it direct to consumer. Before you even make the widget, create a really cool landing page with a sign up and say, hey, do you want to be the first person to buy this new widget? Put in your email address. And you can, just by doing that very basic thing, have some kind of key measurements on whether or not there is demand for your widget. So when we started by just talking to a lot of people in the industry, validating our key assumptions in terms of, are we solving a critical business need? How are we doing that? And are we going to be able to even get patients to use this program or this app or this intervention? And will that program, we knew that through talking to people in the industry, we had to show clinical outcomes, right? You had to show that patients actually got better when using Wellth than if they weren't using Wellth. So again, initially what we did is we started by just seeing, will patients download this app, and we give them incentives, will they take their medications more than when we don't? So we ran a 114-person pilot, which was luckily sponsored by a health plan, but even if it wasn't, we had enough cash to just do it on our own, where we enroll patients from a number of different channels. So we identified, okay, in our business at scale, we could enroll patients directly from provider groups, from hospital beds when they were being discharged. We could enroll patients from phone calls through their health insurance company. We could enroll people through email campaigns. So we're, okay, there's 3 different channels. Let's test the conversion rate in each of those channels. And so we set up a bunch of little micro tests in these different channels, and it doesn't have to be a huge statistically significant thing. You can just test those assumptions in each one of those channels with about 20 or 40 people and see what works, and then iterate based on those kind of learnings. I think Karen mentioned it earlier that sometimes you get qualitative learnings out of this that are more important than quantitative learning. So that early pilot was crucial for us because we showed quantitatively that we were able to increase medication adherence by 78% using our app with incentives behind it. But even more importantly, we conducted 40 user interviews with those patients, of those 114 patients. So we were able to actually talk to them and talk about the process, talk about what they liked, what they didn't like. And that learning from those conversations, which aren't numbers, we couldn't put them in an investor deck, but those learnings, those qualitative learnings have completely guided our product evolution over time. We were able to validate enough of our assumptions around product, around features, that we were able to completely create a new roadmap for our app and start again from the bottom up and recreate our app from the bottom up, which then we are now testing that next evolution of our app and showing great results in real clinical settings in terms of medication adherence. So, our next stage is, okay, so now we have these great clinical results. We're starting to get a huge growth in pipeline. So, there's a bunch, not to go into the weeds, but there's a bunch to read about various stages of pipeline from, how many leads, qualifying your leads, to actually demoing your product, to proposal, to getting a contract out there to closing a deal. So moving people through those various stages, increasing the size of that pipeline in terms of getting more and more people in each stage and moving them through those stages as quickly as possible. That is now something we're starting to measure and focus on, because we're seeing now that we have that clinical validation, now that we have reference customers, it's becoming way easier to have those conversations and move those conversations along as quickly as possible. So now we're measuring things like growth in pipeline, the speed at which, the velocity of which they move through that pipeline into actual bookings. And then the next stage for us will be, how do we do that in a scalable, repeatable fashion where you're able to constantly just spend more resources, hire more salespeople? What is the repeatable process to grow pipeline more, to grow bookings more, and eventually grow revenue more and more?
Perfect. So, Gene, how does a company take, Matt brings up a good point, right? Often in developing thoughtful financial projections, you need to have some early data for some of these early tests and hacks and de-risking. How does, a company translate some of that early data into their first set of financials and projections? And how do they kind of incorporate what they know from the early de-risking, and how they kind of, wave the flag on areas where they have no idea, right? Where they're just making assumptions without any data.
Yeah, so some of our best models that we've built with, has been a good integrated set of management saying, all right, let's kind of put on a whiteboard, what do we know and what don't we know? And begin to build the model from what we do know, and then saying, okay, here's some things we need to find out, but we're going to make our best educated guess. As I said earlier, and I always joke with our clients, we always know that the models are wrong. We just don't know by how much and in which direction. And so, but what we try to do is with our clients is try to sit there and kind of work through, as you talked about, a bottoms up model as much as we, and try to build it and say, okay, these are the things we're going to have to make a leap on. Let's try to make these leaps as conservative as possible, but try to make them conservative but realistic. We don't want to overly conservative. Build is sit there and we try to educate the investor. These are the things we do know. These are the things that we're still working on. But we kind of work that way. But I think starting with a bottoms up model and then working, kind of filling in the gaps as you learn them is the best way to go.
So Matt, you have a model now, right? So you have your early de-risking, you have your early KPIs. How did you go about kind of translating that and developing your first model? And kind of how do you approach managing your KPIs, your dashboard, and your financials kind of in the day-to-day of your business? And by financials, I mean projections.
Yeah, so I think it's all around goal setting for your team and for yourself. So start by thinking, okay, what do we want to accomplish this quarter? And so we just started using OKRs, which if you're not familiar with, it's objectives and key results. So that is a process that Google kind of created, I guess, and there's a great video where you can watch. Just Google for Google Ventures OKRs, and there's an hour-long video talking about everything you need about OKRs. But basically what we do is we look out a quarter, we say, where do we want to be a quarter from now? What are the objectives to hit at that next 3-month time point? What are the key results that will get us those objectives? So for example, if our goal is to close 3 deals in the next quarter, then we start by saying, okay, in order to close 3 deals, we talk to 100 different potential customers. Of those, 10% will convert into the next stage, and then you finally get to the end stage of closing those deals. So I think a lot of it is just knowing where you want to go, setting up, okay, here are the goals in terms of what we want to get to, and what are the steps to get to those goals. And then on a daily basis, just making sure I constantly just remind myself, like, what am I working on, and is that directly impactful to my objective this quarter? Am I doing something that's a complete waste of time? How do I focus on getting those key results? So I think it's just checking in with yourself, checking in with your team often to make sure that you're focused on things that tangibly lead to those quarterly objectives being hit. Does that kind of answer the question?
It does. And so relate OKRs to KPIs.
This is one of my pet peeves with startups, is there's way too many acronyms and they all kind of mean similar things. I think I don't know the textbook definition, but I would say OKRs are good because they more kind of aspirational. It says, where do I want to go? And here's the roadmap to get there. KPIs are more measurements of, are we along the right track? Like how far, so OKRs are like creating the map to the treasure map, and then KPIs would be, where are we on that map versus where we want to go.
Okay. So just, a word to the audience, there's a ton of information on all these things out there on the web if you take a look, or experts like entrepreneurs like Matt who have been doing it, or people like Gene. Stylistically, always include an assumption page in your financial projection. But taking that kind of softball launch, Gene, what's your advice to the audience as to correlating financial projections, execution, KPI dashboards, all these different tools?
So I'm a big believer in the book Scaling Up, that allows you to look at the business. And so we try to do is, with our clients, we'll try to say, where do we want to be in 12 to 18 months? And what are the things we're going to need to do, both qualitative and quantitatively? And so we'll sit there and so what we try to do is, ultimately that forecast will hopefully say, here's where we want to be in 12 to 18 months. And along with the typical balance sheet, cash flow, balance sheet stuff, we'll also have a set of projected KPIs by quarter. So we'll have a bookings, number of customers, and then what we like to do is have our clients on a quarterly basis or on a monthly basis begin to report budget versus actual in terms of the projected KPIs versus the actual KPIs. So we can figure out how well are we doing against achieving the original plan that you know, whether it's for the budget or for what you just pray we did in a new round, so we can see, are we making progress against the plan that we had put out. But I'm a big believer that you can measure most things, and so there may be reasons why you've deviated from the plan, but at least there's a lot of learning and seeing how you're doing against the plan you had. And so, you know, I think for a lot of companies, it's early stage companies, it may be, you know, how many demos that we had, or how many client meetings that we had, and how well we progressed against the pipeline. But ultimately, investors are going to want to see how bookings translating into customers, how much of those customers using the product, and then ultimately how do they renew, and if they do renew, do they renew at a higher price or a lower price. And I think you can project those KPIs and then go back and measure yourself against those KPIs as the year progresses. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I think it's important for people to realize that all these things that we're talking about are tools to help you manage your business. These aren't things that you do to make an investor happy. It's things that you put together to help you really measure and manage your business, because as an early stage company, as Gene said earlier, the only thing you know about your financial projection is that it's wrong. But you're putting stakes in the ground as to what you're trying to measure, what you think is meaningful to your business, and you'll adjust that over time. Matt, are there particular tools as well as techniques, you mentioned OKRs, that you find very useful in helping you and your team manage all this?
Yeah, I think the first point I'm going to make is just that as an early stage startup, all this stuff sounds great, but a lot of times it's really hard, right? You're doing the job of 6 people at once. And even though you want to have these great processes in place, like, you know, you're working 18 hours a day just to answer all the emails you're getting and manage all the different areas of the business. And sometimes, you know, you can set up a plan, and, you know, I like the quote, I think Muhammad Ali said it, everyone has a plan in the face. Well, like, you can create a great plan and put together all these tools and all these great projections, and then when you're actually doing it day to day, you're just too busy to do it. So I just want to let everyone know that I'm not saying by any means that Wellth is a perfect model of how to do things, because we still struggle and learn just like everyone else. So you know, we're all in this together. We've all done the same kind of process together, and as an early stage startup, it's tough. So I think a big thing is just focus, is trying to focus on what matters, creating the processes that you'll actually stick to. And I'm the first person to admit that, you know, I've created a lot of processes before that, you know, sounded great on paper, but then we put them in place and no one, you know, checked that document or actually kept up with that goal. And so we kind of nixed things. So I think that the best thing is just to, in terms of putting these processes in place, figure out what is the process. Okay, so if one of my goals is to create a better pipeline, here's a CRM system we're going to use. So we use Pipedrive. Pipedrive, you know, is a great tool, but again, if you don't actually use it, then it's worthless. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is have weekly meetings in the calendar that are sacred, that everyone involved in sales, we're spending an hour just reviewing the Pipedrive, going through each card in terms of this customer, what is the next follow-up, what do we need to do in order to move it to the next stage, what are the key roadblocks. So I think there's any number of tools out there, and a lot of them are very cheap or free. The biggest issue is not finding the right tools. It's actually setting aside the time and the focus to make sure you're using those tools effectively.
Gene, any advice on kind of the tool side for early stage startups?
No, I don't know if the tool is as important as creating the process and the discipline to develop the reporting that you need to have. I think the most, you know, I'm not a big tool guy, but I think understanding what the the CEO is going to need, or the entrepreneur is going to need to run the business, and making sure that he or she has that information at their disposal and it is consistently used and right, I think is more important than the tool itself.
So, Matt makes a very good point. We all feel the pain. We're all working crazy hours and trying to manage everything. I think Gene's point is true, though, too. If you set things in place early, it actually helps you execute more efficiently in the long run. So the way I like to think about things, and this is just me, you're running like crazy throughout the week trying to meet with customers and de-risk and engage. And the weekends are really for your strategic thinking and some of these more strategic efforts. So there's a lot, like I said, out there to explore. And I would encourage everyone to start thinking about this stuff early, because unless you're measuring, you don't actually know. What about, Gene, just thinking about bringing in a bookkeeping resource or a part-time CFO? How should early stage companies think about that?
Without sounding too self-serving.
Yeah, don't be too self-serving.
Yeah, we've worked with companies where the person's had a finance background and has been able to do a good job for a period of time. And I think what we see is I think there's 2 or 3 things that a company needs to figure out as they think about whether they need a part-time, whether it's bookkeeping, CFO, or something in between. But one is, where is your time being spent? And if the CEO could be spending time with other, either whether it's fundraising, working on the product, or selling, those are probably way more better activities for the advancement of the business than trying to save a couple shekels on closing the books or putting together, a forecast. I think the other thing that hiring people at a more senior level is a lot of times the CFOs have been around the block, have the experience with working with many companies, and can see some of the pitfalls. And so I think getting the numbers right is important, but to a large degree maybe table stakes. I think the more important thing is trying to understand how finance will help drive your business, being able to have the right materials, either whether it's for a board meeting or for your next fundraise. I think those are also things that you need to also consider as you think about kind of what you need to have. I think for a lot of early stage companies, there's probably nothing more wasteful from an investor getting to a board meeting and finding out that the information they have in their hand isn't right. There's nothing that more that irritates an investor or a board member than finding out the information they got the board deck late, they looked at it on the way to the board meeting, and now they find out that the information is right. And I think being able to CEO or entrepreneur leverage their time and allow the experts sometimes to do that work is probably more important than the dollars they're spending.
Matt, you want to share your thoughts?
Sure. So, sorry, what is the key question again? You're on mute, Karen.
Thank you. Thinking how, from a resource perspective, to manage kind of the collection of the metrics and the numbers, and when do you bring in hire someone to do that, have a consultant, whatever. How do you think about managing that process?
Yeah, so I think it often comes out of necessity. So I'll tell you a little funny story about a complete F-up that we made as a company that led us to bring in someone to manage our books. So we're a state corporation. You have to pay every year state franchise taxes to Delaware. The system they use is completely outdated. So you can only use it within Explorer. I didn't know that. I was using Chrome. So there's too much detail, but there's an alternative method of calculating what you owe. So you typically get a bill for like $100,000 based on your share count. Then you do the alternative method as a startup. It actually is like $200. So I did this. I plugged it into Chrome. I hit go. It said, okay, you can either send a check or do direct payment. And I was like, oh, well, direct payment, I'll just be done with it. Boom, hit submit, didn't think twice about it. Little did I know that it actually didn't work because it was through Chrome, went back, reverted to the $200,000 level, and hit our bank account with no safeguards and took $200,000 out of our account. I discovered this the night before, or a few days before our board meeting, because I was doing our update for the board, and it was holy crap. I had to immediately call all my board members, tell them what happened, let them know as soon as possible that I was doing everything to rectify it. Like, good thing was we ended up getting all the money back because it was their mistake, not ours, all that issue. But, you know, it was my first really, really bad up, and I should have caught it right away, but I didn't catch it till a week or two later. So at that point, it became clear that we needed someone to help on the bookkeeping side. So that's just, you know, I guess the key thing as an early stage company, keep burn low and survive another day, right? At a certain point, you know, you have your priorities. When you have enough capital to start investing in aspects of your business, you need to make a gut call and say, where are our priorities? What do we absolutely need in the near term? And, you know, that ranges from hiring more developers, hiring more, spending more on marketing, spending more on customer acquisition, spending more on infrastructure, right? And there is no right answer, but it became very clear that we needed more infrastructure investment, and I wasn't, you know, doing a good job, and, you know, in my defense, because I was trying to do 6 jobs at once. But I completely effed up. I owned it. I let the board know it as quickly as possible. The key learning out of that, as soon as you find out there's a mistake, make sure everyone knows. They were actually not at all pissed that the mistake happened. They were pissed that we didn't catch it right away, and therefore, here's the action plan. So you say, here's the mistake, here's what we need to do to rectify the mistake and make sure it literally nothing like this will ever happen again. As long as you show that as a win and say, take ownership, say I messed up, and here's how we make sure this never happens again, and here's how we do that in the most cost-effective way possible. We evaluated an outside, but we ended up finding an awesome kind of new hire that could serve multiple roles. Was a former accountant, could serve, you know, as our in-house bookkeeper / accountant, and also help on the BD side as well. So, you know, I think there is no hard and fast rule. There's no kind of standard guideline. You just have to kind of, at all points, you have to think about where are my priorities in my business, and where, if I had an extra dollar, where would I spend that dollar, and figure out how to allocate those resources.
Important lesson learned. Thanks for sharing, Matt. Appreciate that. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. Gene, 30 seconds of advice, and then Matt, I'm going to go back to you. 30 seconds of advice.
Sure. I mean, I think for early stage companies, you know, focus on your product, focused on customer acquisition, put all the resources into that. The finance stuff isn't hard, but it's something that needs attention. But most great companies don't need to have great books, but they need to be great at having both a great product and great customer acquisition. And there's plenty of people that can help you on the finance side.
Matt?
I think that's great advice by Gene. I echo all of that. And then just the one thing on finance, especially as it investors and investor relations, honesty and transparency is always the best policy. Whenever you try to oversell your projections, most good investors will see right through that. So always be as transparent and conservative as possible, but, you know, sell them on the dream or the goal that is in the long term.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank Matt and Gene for joining us today and sharing such wonderful information. Check out Wellth at wealthapp.com. Is that correct, Matt?
Yes,
yes, wealthapp.com, or Twitter at wealthapp. Dreamit is dreamit.com, at Dreamit. Gene, what's your website?
G2CFO.com.
Okay. So So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your being here with us. Thanks, guys.